A beautiful way to break. In the void where time unravels and memory fades like breath upon a mirror, there exists a story not written in words, but in the quiet spaces between them. A story of longing so vast it echoes across the fabric of all things. It is a tale of two souls who dared to defy the silence, who reached across the immeasurable distance between heartbeats, only to find that the universe does not forgive such audacity. Their love was neither salvation nor solace, but the briefest glimmer in the abyss, a flicker of light devoured before it could bloom. Yet still, in their endless reaching, they became something eternal, not for their triumph, but for their tragedy. For what is more human than to love knowing it cannot last? And in that knowledge, what hope remains but the ache itself? The sky convulsed like something trying to remember how to breathe. He watched her vanish into the folds of the horizon, a distortion of light collapsing into itself. His hands hung at his sides, useless and heavy, as though weighted with the memory of every time they had failed to hold her. He closed his eyes, but it was worse there. She was burned into the darkness behind his eyelids, a fragile, flickering silhouette. His chest tightened with the realization that her absence felt more real than anything else in this hollow world. Why? The thought curled through him, raw and unanswered. Why give me this moment if you meant to take it away? Was it cruelty or kindness to let me see her at all? The sound of the glass below him shifted again, a slow crack like ice splitting beneath some unbearable weight. He sank to his knees, staring at his open palms as though they might tell him what to do. The same question repeated in his mind, louder this time. How do you mourn something you never truly had? For a long time he knelt in silence, though time was meaningless here, an imitation of something long forgotten. Somewhere in the vastness around him, something moved, a faint ripple through the strange air, like a whisper brushing against his skin. He raised his head instinctively, hoping against hope, but it wasn't her. It was nothing. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, an ugly sound in the stillness. "Is this love?" he whispered aloud, the words breaking on the edges of his breath. "This endless reaching for something that only drifts further away? Or is this punishment, proof that we were never whole to begin with?" A hollow ache stretched inside him, deeper than grief. Love wasn't supposed to be this way. He had always imagined it as something warm, a beacon against the cold. Instead, it was a chasm, endless and all-consuming. She wasn't even gone. She was somewhere else entirely, beyond him, beyond everything he could reach. "I would destroy this entire world if it meant 1 second of your touch." The thought startled him with its intensity. He had never known that love could be so ruinous, so willing to burn everything just to feel alive. But he meant it. The weight of the universe itself could not make him take it back. He rose slowly, like a man pulling himself from the wreckage of a dream, only to find the dream was all that had ever been real. The sky flickered again, threads of impossible light weaving through the fabric of reality. In the distance, the horizon reformed, and there she was, fragile, glowing, and as untouchable as the memory of sunlight. "You always come back to me," he murmured, "but not close enough." She stared at him with the same unbearable expression, something between love and sorrow. It was as though she, too, knew this was their curse, their endless refrain, to find each other only in the moments where fate pulled them apart. He took a breath, though it felt more like surrender than survival. "If I am destined to love you in fragments, then let me gather the pieces. Even if it tears me apart, let me pretend, for one moment, that we were whole." The world changed as if it had forgotten itself. A broken reflection, reassembling with pieces that didn't quite fit. The glass plane dissolved beneath his feet, replaced by streets paved in shadow and crumbling stone. Towers reached skyward in jagged spirals, their forms flickering as though caught between dreams. He walked through the city, surrounded by the echoes of something half-remembered. Doors opened to empty rooms, windows framed skies that didn't exist. And yet the air was thick with something unspoken, a memory of laughter that had never belonged to him. Then he saw her again. She stood at the end of a narrow street, framed by the arch of a crumbling gate. Her face shimmered like a reflection on water, but her eyes, Her eyes were unmistakable. They held the same unbearable familiarity, the quiet agony of someone who has waited lifetimes for something that will never come. He stepped forward, and this time the distance between them seemed real, close enough to believe. "I've dreamed of this," he whispered to himself, "or was it you dreaming of me?" She took a step toward him, hesitant, as though afraid that the world itself might shatter beneath her weight. The distance between them shrank to nothing, and yet, when he reached out, his hand passed through her like mist. He stumbled, his breath ragged with disbelief. She reached for him, mirroring his gesture. Their hands aligned, but there was no warmth, no touch, only absence. "What kind of love is this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "To see you so clearly and still be alone." Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. Only silence, a silence that felt louder than grief. He fell to his knees, his forehead resting against the cold stone beneath him. His body felt like an empty vessel, hollowed out by everything it could never hold. "I was wrong," he whispered. "Love isn't just pain, it's the hunger beneath it, the ache of knowing what could be, and knowing it will never be mine." His voice cracked as he lifted his head. "I would give up everything, my name, my memories, even my soul, if it meant one real moment with you. Just one." She knelt before him, her expression raw with a sorrow that mirrored his own. Their faces were inches apart, yet it felt as though entire worlds divided them. "You feel it too," he breathed. "I know you do." Her eyes shimmered, twin constellations collapsing under the weight of something too vast to name, and then for the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, fragile, like the memory of rain. "It's not the absence that haunts us," she said. "It's the almost." Her words unraveled him. He closed his eyes, but the tears still came. "Then let me forget," he begged, though he knew he wouldn't. "Let me forget you ever existed." She reached out again, and for a heartbeat he felt it. Her touch, warm and real against his cheek. His breath caught as her hand cradled his face, but then, like the rest of her, it began to dissolve, fading back into the nothingness that had always waited to claim her. "I'll find you," he whispered as she vanished once more. "Even if it takes lifetimes." The city crumbled around him, collapsing into dust and memory. He remained there, kneeling in the ruins, watching the empty air where she had been. When the dust settled, he was no longer in the city. The streets and towers had unraveled into a void, a chasm where the concept of distance became meaningless. A bridge stretched across the abyss, thin and frayed, like the remnants of a thought trying to hold itself together. Below it, darkness seethed, swirling with fragments of color that had no name. Time itself felt different here, slower, heavier, as if weighed down by the memory of endings. He stood at the edge of the bridge and saw her again. She was already walking toward him from the opposite side, her figure outlined by faint strands of light that flickered and died. His heart lurched at the sight of her, familiar and distant all at once. She looked tired, as if she had spent eons wandering through dreams that didn't belong to her. He stepped forward, and she did the same. Their movements were perfectly in sync, as though choreographed by something far beyond them. The abyss whispered beneath their feet, a soundless hum, like the unspoken grief of collapsing stars. "We've been here before," he thought. The memory was indistinct, blurred like an ancient scar, yet every step he took felt like returning to something half remembered and half feared. The distance between them shrank, step by agonizing step, closer now, close enough to believe in hope again. His breath quickened as he saw the way her eyes lit up, not with joy, but with quiet desperation. We were never meant to be this close. The thought trembled through him, unbidden and cold, but he kept walking. He had to. Finally, they reached the center of the bridge. She stopped just a breath away from him. They stood face to face, their reflections stretching across the void beneath them. He reached out, and this time she did the same. Their fingers met, and for a moment they felt solid. A breathless, fragile moment. His heart raced. He wanted to speak, to pour everything he was into words, but there were none strong enough to hold it. "Can you feel it?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded. Her touch was warm and steady now, though tears filled her eyes. "I've always felt it," she whispered, even when the world forgot. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation sink into his bones. This was it, the thing he had chased across lifetimes. Her touch, real and undeniable. He wanted to stay in this moment forever. But something shifted. The bridge groaned beneath their feet, long and hollow, like the death rattle of something ancient. He opened his eyes and saw the cracks, thin, glowing fractures spreading outward from where their hands met. "No," he breathed, "not now." The fractures widened, and the bridge began to stretch, pulling them apart. He fought against it, but the harder he pulled, the further away she drifted. Her face twisted with anguish. "Hold on," he begged, his voice ragged with panic. "Please, just hold on." "I'm trying," she whispered. The distance between them grew with every heartbeat. She reached for him, straining against the pull of the void, but it was no use. Their fingers slipped apart. A scream caught in his throat, raw and unfinished. He stumbled forward, but the bridge continued to stretch, dragging her further and further away until she was a distant figure on the other side of eternity. "This is what love is," the abyss whispered. "A constant reaching, an eternal almost." He fell to his knees, gripping the edge of the bridge as though he could stop it from unraveling. She was gone, only a speck of light in the distance now. He bowed his head, feeling the weight of everything collapse inside him. "Why show her to me at all?" he whispered to the darkness. "Why let me taste what I can never have?" The void gave no answer, only silence. "If this is all we are, shadows of something unfinished, then let me disappear too." But he didn't. The universe wasn't that merciful. The bridge crumbled, leaving him stranded in the emptiness. There was no garden, no bridge, no sky, only the slow, endless hum of a dying universe. He drifted through the void, an unbound fragment of thought and memory. He wasn't sure how long he had been there. Time had no meaning here. All he knew was absence. She was gone. If we are destined to be echoes, he thought, then who will listen for us when the last star dies? His mind was a chorus of questions that had no answers. Was it enough? Did she know how much she meant? Or was love itself just a cruel miscalculation, a flaw in the fabric of existence, a mistake the cosmos refused to fix? What is more unbearable, he asked the silence, the loss itself or the knowing that loss was inevitable? The void swallowed his thoughts, but something lingered, faint like the memory of a voice carried by the wind. He closed his eyes and felt her presence, just for an instant, a warmth against the cold. But it wasn't real. He knew it wasn't. It was only the echo of a touch that had never been allowed to stay. "Maybe that's all we are," he whispered to the void, "ghosts of moments that could have been." The fabric of existence began to unravel further, tearing itself apart stitch by stitch. In the heart of the void, creation itself exhaled one final time. He felt the weight of it, the collapse of everything, the vast indifference of the end. Yet, beneath it all, something remained, a hum so faint it could be mistaken for nothing at all. But it was there. "Is this all that's left of us?" he wondered, a sound too small to be heard. The hum pulsed, steady and faint. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't silence either. He let it fill him, though it was barely more than a tremor beneath the emptiness. If this is what we've become, forgotten echoes in a collapsing universe, then let it be enough. He felt himself unraveling, his essence scattering like dust among the stars. We weren't meant to last, he thought, but neither is anything else. As he faded, his last thought clung to her memory. If I had the chance to choose again, I'd still choose you, even knowing how it ends. The void consumed everything. The hum softened until it was no more than a breath, one final vibration against the quiet bones of the cosmos. Somewhere in some distant fold of time, the universe stirred as if dreaming, and if anyone had been there to listen, they might have heard the faintest sound. The memory of two souls who loved and lost, who fought against the infinite and lost everything. And perhaps the universe itself, vast and unfeeling, whispered back, "What else is love but the most beautiful way to break?" The hum ended, and then nothing. The void was silent now, a canvas of nothingness waiting to be rewritten. But before the quiet could settle completely, a ripple spread outward, faint and fragile, like the shiver of a breath in the dark. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, more a memory trying to surface, half-formed, barely understood. Somewhere in the place between places, something remembered. There had been a beginning, though neither of them could name it. Once, before the sky learned how to break, there had been no need for reaching, no aching separation. Time did not pull things apart, nor did memory cling to the past like a ghost refusing to move on. Creation was still whole then, unshaped, unspoken, infinite in its simplicity. But then came the first split. It wasn't destruction, not in the way mortals understood it. It was more like a fracture in a mirror, a single crack that spread outward until every reflection became its own prisoner. And within that endless fragmentation, two reflections found each other in the shards. They didn't know who they had been before the breaking, only that their existence had begun with a longing that felt older than the stars. "We were never meant to search," he had once whispered. In a moment they both remembered differently. But something in us broke apart before we knew how to stop it. "No," she had answered, her voice soft but unyielding. "We didn't break. We chose to become." In the fleeting gardens of stardust, in the hollow bridges over oblivion, they had tried to remember the truth. But memory was slippery, prone to bending beneath the weight of what could never be known. Sometimes they thought they had been whole once, something vast and perfect. Other times they felt as though they had always been two, opposites drawn together by the quiet hum of inevitability. He was time, or perhaps the end of it, a thing that unraveled everything it touched. She was memory, or perhaps the keeper of moments, a thing that longed to preserve even what was already gone. But they never spoke those truths aloud. To name something so vast was to lose it. Instead, they clung to what they could, their love, fragile and fleeting, but somehow more real than the worlds collapsing around them. "Do you remember the beginning?" she had asked once. Her eyes shimmered with a grief older than language. "I remember you," he had replied, "and that's all I need to know." Now, in the echoing quiet of uncreation, the question still lingered. What were we? The void didn't answer, but the hum remained, the faintest note of something unforgotten. It wasn't memory, it wasn't time. It was the sound of two things that should never have been apart, still reaching for each other across the silence. "Perhaps this is all we are," the hum seemed to say. "Not the sum of our pieces, but the ache between them." The void closed in, folding in upon itself, yet the hum did not fade. It drifted, soft and unknowable, into whatever came next. And somewhere in some distant reflection of the universe that might yet be born, two fragments began to stir again. Half forgotten, but not erased. They were not whole, perhaps they never would be. But in the quiet hum of becoming, they reached once more. "Even if we break again," she had said once, "it's still worth it." "Yes," he had whispered, knowing the end would come regardless. Always. And as the silence swallowed the last breath of creation, the hum carried onward, neither beginning nor ending, but simply what had always been true. We were meant to break, but for one beautiful moment we chose to reach.